Hello everyone, welcome to the Tim Booker channel. I hope you enjoy listening to books. Today, I want to talk to you about a book titled Empire and Revolution, The Political Life of Edmund Burke. This is a monumental biography spanning over 1032 pages, focusing on Edmund Burke, an 18th-century British philosopher. While Burke might not be a household name for everyone, in European and American political thought, his stature is exceptionally high. In any Western political thought history published in Britain or the United States, alongside renowned names like Kant and Marx, you'll invariably encounter Burke. Often described as the father of political conservatism, Burke garners immense respect from politicians in both Britain and America. Winston Churchill particularly admired Burke, frequently referencing his writings and speeches. Churchill even remarked, "Among the eminent men born into Ireland, Burke was the greatest." However, there's a paradox here. Conservatism isn't typically a term associated with positive connotations. It's often linked to resistance to change and maintaining the status quo. So why is Burke, dubbed the father of conservatism, so revered? The essence lies in Burke's version of conservatism, which didn't entail opposition to all reform or revolution. Burke was supportive of the American colonies' resistance against Britain during their struggle for independence. What he fundamentally opposed was the radical revolution of the French kind. He argued that a revolution disregarding existing rules and traditions, solely adhering to abstract ideas, would inevitably lead to catastrophic consequences. The concept of the tyranny of the majority, widely spoken of today, was initially proposed by Burke. It was in this sense that Burke advocated for political prudence and criticized the French Revolution, earning him the title of the father of conservatism. Yet, was Burke's intellectual legacy limited to this aspect alone? Not at all. The title of this book, Empire and Revolution, aptly encapsulates the two main pillars of Burke's thought. In response to the significant changes of the late 18th century, he deeply analyzed the American and French revolutions. To ensure stability within his homeland, Burke also delved into domestic affairs, offering extensive insights into parliamentary politics, free trade, and the party system. The concept of representative government, familiar to us today, finds its intellectual foundation in Burke's ideas. His discourse on free markets even directly inspired later economists like Hayek. If you seek to understand the development of Western politics up to the present day, comprehending some of its distinctive rules and intricacies, Burke is an unavoidable figure. However, comprehending Burke's ideas proves rather challenging. He wasn't merely an academic thinker but an engaged political actor. Throughout his 68-year life, Burke served as a member of Parliament, a university chancellor, and a secretary to the Prime Minister, amassing a wealth of experiences. While he did write several books, he favored delivering speeches. These speeches were often rich in references, adorned with eloquence, but could become incredibly challenging once divorced from their specific contexts. Hence, understanding Burke's thoughts necessitates revisiting his political career and the contextual backdrop of his speeches. And this book, Empire and Revolution, precisely discusses Burke's political experiences. Upon completing this book, not only will you gain a systematic understanding of Burke's life and ideas, but you'll also realize how profoundly Edmund Burke has influenced modern British and American politics. Interestingly, the author of this book shares the surname Burke, Richard Burke, although he has no familial relations with the central figure, Edmund Burke. Professor Edmund Burke is a distinguished scholar of political thought history at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of the British Academy. In preparation for writing Empire and Revolution, he dedicated nearly a decade, re-examining Burke's manuscripts and tracing the origins of Burke's political thought. After its publication in English in 2015, this book immediately caused a stir in academic circles and was hailed as the best book of the year by both The Guardian and The Spectator magazines in the UK. Undoubtedly, it stands as the most authoritative work to understand the person Edmund Burke. Next, I'll split the discussion into two parts, introducing you to the main content of this book. Firstly, we'll explore the significant events in Burke's convoluted political career and the insights he gained from them. In the second part, I'll analyze the crucial intellectual legacies of Burke, how these legacies aid our understanding of contemporary Western politics, and the assistance they offer. Before delving into the contents of this book, let me pose a question. Burke was born in 1729. Do you have an idea about the political situation in Britain at that time? This question might stump those not versed in world history. While we might recall the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution of the 17th century, marking Britain's shift towards constitutional monarchy, what follows the Glorious Revolution might not be as familiar. Post the Glorious Revolution, Britain experienced over 60 years of political instability. In 1714, the British throne faced a vacancy, which fell into the hands of George, a German relative from Hanover. This marked the inception of the Hanoverian dynasty in England. The kings from this dynasty lacked local roots but ardently sought to emulate the absolute monarchies of continental Europe, leading to conflicts with the British Parliament. However, even within the Parliament, there was internal discord. Following the Glorious Revolution, Britain essentially had only one governing party, the Whigs. The majority of this party's parliamentary members didn't emerge from legitimate elections but were from sparsely populated, remote hereditary estates. Due to this lack of competition, the Whig Party gradually became corrupt and faction-ridden, controlled by a few powerful nobles. Britain at that time was brewing a new political crisis. Edmund Burke emerged onto the scene in such a delicate historical moment. He belonged to the same era as Adam Smith, Locke, and Kant, but Burke's family background was rather unique. He was born in Ireland, and his mother was a Catholic, both aspects considered non-mainstream in Britain during that time. Ireland wasn't part of Britain's core dominion, it was fully conquered only in the 16th century, essentially a colony within Britain. Catholics, post the Glorious Revolution, became marginalized in politics, facing suspicion and discrimination. Though Burke himself, like his father, adhered to the mainstream Protestant faith, he experienced the peculiar fears and insecurities of being on the margins from a young age. Burke's aversion to the tyranny of the majority originated from this period. However, his family background didn't burden young Burke too heavily. His educational journey progressed smoothly. By the time Burke graduated from Trinity College in Dublin in 1748, he was well versed in Greek philosophy, ancient history, and literature, showcasing excellent writing skills. Burke's father, a lawyer, hoped his son would follow in his footsteps, but Burke, with his free-spirited nature and diverse interests, preferred being a professional writer. Thus, starting from the 1750s, Burke resided in London, earning a living through writing. He didn't write novels or plays but rather pamphlets discussing philosophy, history, and political issues. Figures like Burke, as amateur intellectuals, were quite common during the Enlightenment. Burke had a knack for referencing historical precedents, whether discussing religion, aesthetics, or European history, which quickly gained him recognition. His reputation from writing also paved the way for him to enter politics. In 1765, the newly appointed Prime Minister of Britain, the Marquis of Rockingham, appointed Burke as his private secretary and later helped him secure a seat in the House of Commons. This marked the beginning of Burke's political career. Why did an amateur writer like Burke secure a place in politics? It was due to the prevailing atmosphere in Britain at that time. Before the advent of the modern party system, apart from behind-the-scenes maneuvers by core politicians, debates in the British Parliament relied heavily on speeches. Burke, a brilliant orator himself who could craft speeches for others, had an essential advantage. Throughout 28 years as a Member of Parliament, his speeches were the highlights. By the 1780s, attending Parliament to witness Burke engaging in verbal sparring had become a significant pastime in London's high society. Even aristocratic women, unfamiliar with philosophy, applauded Burke's eloquence. However, Burke's timing for entering politics wasn't ideal. Firstly, in 1760, Britain welcomed a new king, George III, a young and assertive monarch keen on meddling in practical affairs. Dissatisfied with being a puppet in Parliament, he aimed to incite political strife by exploiting the factional conflicts within the Whig Party and public sentiments, introducing numerous uncertainties into politics. Additionally, Burke's boss, Prime Minister Rockingham, had an unstable foundation. Rockingham led a faction within the Whig Party, lacked widespread support, and had a tense relationship with the king, leading to his dismissal within a year of assuming office. Until 1782, Rockingham was reappointed to form a government. Essentially, for 15 years during this period, Rockingham and his secretary, Burke, played the role of opposition, devoid of actual power. Lacking real power didn't mean they didn't need to make their stance known. In the 1770s, Britain faced a significant issue: its relationship with the North American colonies began deteriorating rapidly. Having recently won the 7 Years' War against France, Britain's overseas colonial territory expanded significantly. However, the financial strain from the war led the British government to intensify wealth extraction, especially through new taxes on goods exported to North America. According to the political and business elites in North America, they had shouldered significant responsibilities during the war against France but were now being treated as mere cash cows by the British, which was unacceptable. Consequently, the residents of North America put forth a famous slogan: "No taxation without representation." Essentially, for Britain to impose new taxes in North America, they needed to acknowledge equal political rights for North America and Britain itself and allow them to elect their representatives to Parliament. King George III and his government, naturally, refused. Thus, the resistance in North America gradually escalated into a movement demanding independence, culminating in a war in 1775. During the years when tensions in North America were escalating, Burke continuously criticized the British government's strategies through speeches and publications. He argued that Britain's own political history revolved around taxation and representation issues. It wasn't surprising for North America to make similar demands. After all, when Britain first colonized North America, they promised the local elites the right to representation. Backtracking now was self-destructive. Moreover, over the past century, the British government had immensely benefited from monopolizing North American trade. Levying new taxes now displayed greed and would directly push North America into opposition. Burke emphasized repeatedly that an 18th-century empire like Britain was entirely different in nature from ancient Rome or the Ottoman Empire. It needed acceptance from the colonial populace to ensure long-term rule. Acceptance hinged on the paramount power exercising only regulatory, not unchecked coercive, authority over the colonies. This model, termed the Free Empire, was Burke's original idea. Looking at it from today's perspective, it unquestionably falls under imperialistic thinking, requiring critique, but at that time, it held a certain progressive stance. The leaders of the North American independence movement also resonated with Burke's ideas, even later erecting a statue in his honor in Washington, D.C. However, Burke's eloquence alone couldn't sway the decisions of the British government. Despite his efforts through speeches and publications, the 13 colonies in North America ultimately separated from Britain after a fierce independence war. At this point, Burke began offering suggestions to deal with the aftermath. While he wasn't entirely in favor of North American independence, he wisely pointed out that continuing the war was harmful to Britain, stating that peace is everything. Under Burke's urging, King George III was compelled in 1782 to reappoint Rockingham as Prime Minister and sign the Treaty of Paris the following year, recognizing American independence. As Rockingham's secretary, Burke was promoted and became Paymaster of the Forces, a position responsible for the Army's finances, not extremely high-ranking but lucrative. However, Burke didn't capitalize on this opportunity because, within just 3.5 months of Rockingham's appointment, he succumbed to influenza. This incident led to the formal split of the Whig Party, triggering over 40 years of internal strife and adversely affecting Burke's career prospects. Yet, Burke's focus wasn't on climbing the ladder for wealth and power. In 1786, he presented a report in the House of Commons, seeking an investigation into corruption allegations against Warren Hastings, the former Governor-General of British India. This was the famous Hastings impeachment in British political history. Burke, who had been focusing on the North American issue, suddenly turned his attention to India. To understand this shift, we need to go back to the first keyword in the title of this book, empire. According to Burke, overseas colonies like North America and India, though miles apart, held immense strategic value. Proper governance of these territories was crucial for the continuity of the British Empire. North America was already a problem, and India couldn't afford to face similar challenges. However, Hastings, the Governor-General, had been extorting money and attempting to impose British laws on India, causing strong discontent locally and jeopardizing British interests. Burke saw himself as the embodiment of Indian rights. He publicly criticized Hastings and the East India Company, which had long controlled Indian affairs, aiming to make all Britons recognize the flaws in the current colonial system. In February 1788, the Hastings impeachment commenced in Parliament. Burke, armed with a stack of materials, delivered a 4-day-long thematic speech. Many British nobles and common citizens flooded the chamber to witness Burke's eloquence. Interestingly, Hastings himself later recalled, "I stared at Burke for half an hour, listening to his eloquent accusations against me. I began to feel as if he was somewhat reasonable, as if I were the greatest sinner in the world." Burke's argument still centered on his free empire doctrine. He advocated impeaching Hastings not just due to suspicions of corruption but also for his unethical rule in India. He extorted money arbitrarily and formulated policies based on personal whims, damaging societal ethics and transforming British rule from a public service to an accessory of private desires. If Britain continued unchecked down this path without holding Hastings accountable, India would eventually revolt, becoming the next North America. By now, you might have noticed, Burke's impeachment of Hastings wasn't a simple judicial case. He turned the courtroom into a platform to propagate his personal beliefs, challenging the imperfect colonial system from afar. However, the flaws in this approach were evident: too much theory, too little evidence. Hastings' allies seized this loophole, turning the impeachment into a trivial judicial review. As a result, the entire case dragged on for 7 years before Hastings was eventually declared innocent by the House of Lords. By that time, Burke had exited politics, entering the final phase of his life. In the 8 years before his death, Burke engaged in another significant undertaking, vehemently criticizing the French Revolution. This critique earned him the moniker, "Father of Conservatism." In November 1790, Burke published the long-considered work Reflections on the Revolution in France, which caused a stir in Europe and saw 11 reprints within 10 months. In this book, Burke, contrary to his praise for the American Revolution a decade earlier, condemned the French Revolution as a disaster. He wasn't defending the decaying Bourbon monarchy. He argued that France, on the eve of the Revolution, was like a dilapidated fortress, unjust and unkind. The problem lay in the fervent revolutionaries who, besides tearing down the fortress and driving out its occupants, lacked the capability to construct new dwellings. Burke asserted that the French Revolution's slogans like liberty, equality, fraternity, were mere abstract principles. Disconnected from the organic entity of French society, these ideals failed to develop a corresponding legal system. It was akin to a patient in dire need of medicine, while the revolutionaries stressed everyone's right to medicine, but couldn't prescribe it. Worse, these abstract principles were prone to exploitation by the ambitious, ultimately giving rise to a military dictatorship. Here, Burke foresaw Napoleon's rise several years in advance. The publication of Reflections on the Revolution in France catapulted Burke's political standing to new heights. Even King George III, who had never favored Burke, proposed bestowing an earldom upon him. Yet, Burke declined this favor, retiring to his estate, spending his remaining years in writing until his death in 1797. Burke's close friend and Oxford University professor, Lawrence, lamented, "When he fell, Europe and the entire civilized world lost its last pillar." These are the main political experiences of Edmund Burke recorded in this book. After listening to these stories, you might still find it challenging to understand why Burke is so important. He was just a scholar who talked big for decades without accomplishing much, right? In terms of career, he never became prime minister or managed to transform the Whig Party into a modern political entity. Regarding his political views, his suggestions concerning North America and India's colonies were scarcely adopted by the British government. Moreover, many of Burke's stances on the French Revolution contradicted his earlier assessments. Marx didn't hold Burke in high regard, viewing him as someone who constantly adapted to the political winds. However, Winston Churchill, who had a tumultuous political career and was also a skilled orator, consistently defended Burke. Churchill argued that Burke's flaw was being too serious and too all-encompassing. He aimed to overhaul 18th-century British politics and even had a plan ready. Regrettably, the fractured Whig Party couldn't offer him full support, and his contemporaries couldn't comprehend his earnest endeavors. Otherwise, according to Churchill, Burke would have become the greatest statesman in British history. Why did Churchill say this? It stems from understanding Burke's main political concerns. Throughout his life, Burke was most concerned about 5 things: the fate of Irish Catholics, the future of the Whig Party, the relationship between monarchy and Parliament, Britain's overseas rule, and the impact of the French Revolution. These 5 issues precisely correspond to the 5 foundational aspects of modern Western nations: religious and civil affairs, party systems, domestic power distribution, overseas colonies, and the legitimacy of government authority. In other words, Burke's ideas encompassed most elements of modern states, diverse in form, but not in spirit. Future politicians seeking answers to any of these issues can turn to Burke's works for guidance. That's why, although unfulfilled in his lifetime, Burke received increasing admiration after entering the 19th century. It's especially worth noting that when Burke articulated his views, they weren't sudden inspirations but were contextualized within historical and legal dimensions. For instance, when discussing the concept of political balance, he would delve into the historical interplay among the monarchy, nobility, and commoners in England, detailing the conditions necessary to achieve balance. While examining Britain's conquest of India, he'd inquire, besides violence, what legal relationship formed between the British government and the Indians. In such relationships, what obligations did Britain need to fulfill? This methodical exploration, characterized by logical coherence, naturally carried more persuasive weight. So, what important warnings did Burke leave regarding his 5 major concerns? Let's summarize them based on the contents of the book Empire and Revolution, for you. Burke's intellectual legacy can be summarized in 3 key terms. The first term is prudence. Although this term may sound ordinary, it holds profound significance. Burke borrowed a concept from Montesquieu known as the spirit of conquest. It refers to the complete reliance on force to acquire land, enslave populations, and indulge the nation's possessive desires. Burke believed that this phenomenon could be tolerated in specific historical stages. For instance, the expansion of the Roman Empire and early British colonial history were embodiments of this spirit of conquest. However, he emphasized that once the initial phase of expansion concluded, the spirit of conquest had to yield to the spirit of liberty. Every subject of the empire must willingly serve its interests from the heart. The core of the spirit of liberty isn't indulgence but rather the rule of law and prudence. Liberty implies prudence, which significantly differs from our usual impressions. Why did Burke say this? He considered liberty, not as individual spiritual freedom but as a political concept. He argued that liberty itself is abstract and hard to define. It only becomes feasible when linked to specific rights. To gain rights, obligations must be undertaken. Balancing these relationships requires prudence. For example, if a colony like North America assumes tax obligations without corresponding rights, its resistance is justified. The British government erred by lacking prudence and restraint. Conversely, Burke's critique of the French Revolution primarily centered on its lack of prudence. Its advocacy for political freedom was boundless and would inevitably lead to upheaval. Hayek highly praised Burke's view of liberty. Burke's second key term was organic history. While this term might seem abstract, within the context of 18th century England, it's more understandable. We've heard of the English-American legal system and the continental legal system, emphasizing precedent in the English-American system. This distinction not only exists in the judiciary but also in constitutional matters. England lacks a written constitution. Acts of Parliament, judgments of senior judges, and even some customary rules play a constitutional role. Conversely, the European continent, starting from the late 18th century with the French Revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man, witnessed the trend of formulating written constitutions. Did England need to follow this new trend? Burke's answer was negative. He believed that the difference in constitutional forms between England and the continent stemmed from their distinct histories. England's unwritten constitution evolved from the prolonged struggle between monarchy and aristocracy since the 13th century. The outcome of this struggle also shaped England's social structure. In other words, the unwritten constitution in England was a collective choice. It stemmed from the organic development of English history, aligning with contemporary social realities. Similarly, continental countries opted for written constitutions to counter the rapid expansion of absolute monarchy from the 16th to 18th centuries. Since England hadn't experienced this historical phase, it didn't need to blindly imitate. Burke believed that every country's political system and traditions were results of long-term historical developments. A nation encompasses both territory and population and evolves organically throughout history. While there may be fundamental agreements among nations, blindly transplanting ideals from other nations, especially abstract slogans and goals, would invariably face historical repercussions. In this sense, Burke again criticized the French Revolution, claiming that its slogan chanting without historical understanding wouldn't help resolve the contradictions exposed in French society and the economy. Burke's third key term was balance. This term targeted the political situation in 18th century England. Burke argued that post the Glorious Revolution, there was a compromise between the monarchy and parliament in England, but it was unstable. The king couldn't veto parliamentary bills or unilaterally enact new laws, but he could indirectly influence personnel arrangements. For instance, the appointment of nobles and the selection of nobles into the House of Lords fell within the king's powers. Strong monarchs like George III even instigated internal conflicts within Parliament to position favoured politicians as prime ministers. Although Parliament seemed capable of checking the monarchy, its operational mechanisms were coarse. The Whig Party, as the sole ruling party, internally wrestled between old land aristocrats and emerging industrialists, often manipulated by the king. Whig Party members, ostensibly accountable to the public, actually lacked proper authorization. In 18th century England, suffrage was tied to property thresholds, with less than 4% of the population having voting rights. Constituency demarcations remained unchanged for over 300 years, drawn up in the 15th century. Wealthy landowners needed to sway a few dozen voters in a small constituency to support a new member of parliament. MPs elected by fewer than 100 voters accounted for half of the House of Commons. Even Burke himself was elected in this manner in the rotten borough of Rockingham. However, Burke didn't praise the old system simply because he benefited from it due to connections. He argued that as legislators, if MPs were accountable to just a few dozen voters or were beholden to large aristocrats, their vision would become increasingly narrow and detached from the public. To change this situation, a thorough transformation of electoral and party systems was necessary, establishing a genuine representative system. The foundation of a representative system lay in clearly defining public interests, prioritizing the nation and its people. This necessitated a balance between MPs' personal aspirations and public interests. Additionally, political parties needed clear manifestos and strict discipline. They should be bound by integrity rather than blatant financial inducements to control their MPs. Only then could Parliament, as a whole, counterbalance the monarchy and other executive powers. By the 19th century, when the two-party system began to take shape in British and American politics, they extensively referred to Burke's propositions. By this point, you may have realized that Burke doesn't fit neatly into either the right or left categories. His political ideology is oriented towards balance. The real Burke wasn't against change. He was concerned that overly radical revolutions would overturn the entire social structure and a consensus formed by history, ultimately harming freedom itself. Such notions, of course, have limitations, but the reflective perspective they provide remains relevant today. Alright, that's the main content of Empire and Revolution that I've introduced to you. When evaluating a politician's historical standing, we mainly look at the practical accomplishments they've achieved. In this sense, Burke's political career isn't notably successful. However, positioning Burke as a political thinker and assessing his long-term contributions, he stands out remarkably. During the 18th century pivotal period in Western history, concepts like the spirit of liberty, representative governance, and the organic nature of history, proposed by Burke deeply influenced the political modernization process in countries like England and America. Although there might be flaws within these concepts, they don't diminish the significance of his contributions. The conservative tradition initiated by Burke, juxtaposed with the revolutionary tradition initiated by the French Revolution, engaged in mutual debate yet influenced each other, collectively shaping modern Western politics. While we pay tribute to the passion and idealism of the French Revolution, we shouldn't forget Burke, the advocate of prudence and balance, who laid the groundwork for these ideas. Moreover, from Burke's life experiences, we, as ordinary individuals, can gain valuable insights. Burke was a beneficiary of political connections, but he didn't prioritize personal desires. Instead, he advocated for integrity and aloof political ethics, putting the public interest first. This undoubtedly embodies genuine independence of character. Burke's distinction between the abstract and the specific can also serve us in our daily lives. When we find ourselves inclined towards an abstract new thought or concept, it might be worth considering: can it be directly applied to our own situations? Do we need to consider specific external conditions? Revisiting Burke's teachings can ring warning bells in these situations. That's the essence of this book. Congratulations on completing another book. Thank you all for your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel, like, and share this valuable knowledge with your friends. Let's combine wisdom and practice, achieve our financial goals, and create a better future together. Thank you, goodbye.